And with that, I think we should kick off. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mehmet, and I'm delighted to have you join us for today's session, which will be covering the history of fire. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on. For me, this is the lands of the Kaurna people in the Adelaide Plains region. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and acknowledge and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and elders from other communities who may be joining us today. If you are dialing in from other parts of Australia, you may wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians where you are based. Please feel free to drop in the chat where you are joining from. Just some really quick housekeeping. As mentioned, this session will be recorded and a copy of that will be made available on our FHIRside webpage. The Q&A function can be used throughout the session, so please feel free to add any questions you may have. If we could please ask you to stay on mute during the presentation time, and then we'll get through to any questions at the end of the webinar. Please use the chat as you wish to share any reflections, insights, experiences, and perspectives. And if we don't have time to get through your question during the call, please email us and we will endeavour to get back to you. Now, with that, I'd like to hand over to Grahame Grieve, the man who needs no introduction, to run us through the history of fire. So over to you, Grahame.
Hey, Mehmet, thank you very much. Oh, you can hear me good? Okay, all right. So let's start by getting my presentation up. Yes, here we go. Okay, so hopefully I'll leave a bit of time for questions, but just the history of fire. And thanks to the agency for inviting me to do this. And I'll acknowledge my local peoples, the Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Now, fire, this is a slide that I've been using to introduce fire for 12 years now, I think. Healthcare has broken processes. It's not because people want broken processes. People try as hard as they can with their bit. But actually, that's kind of the problem, because it's all the bits between the bits that are the broken processes that all of us experience in our families. I was watching other industries being transformed back in 2000 and early 2010s, and IT was enabling that process transformation, but it was not happening in healthcare. It is happening to some degree now, but it was not happening. And from my point of view, a big part of this was that the IT standards to integrate B2B and consumer to business don't exist. And when they do, they're not well implemented. It's not IT's a solution to everything, right? There's lots of other reasons healthcare is a problem. And it's really hard to change the way healthcare works. But from my point of view, IT is a blocker. You can't really take those other things on because it's just not worth it, given that IT can't deliver. And so I thought I could take that part on and work on that part. Now, a lot of what comes driven by this document. This document was the basis for the technical standards underlying the PCHR, published by the agency with my review and endorsement back in 2007. This is an extremely hard document to get hold of now, even within the agency. I gave them a copy last week because they couldn't find it in their archives internally. But it was published, but it was public. So either I or the agency can send it to you, and it outlined the basis for choosing an XDS-based CDA repository. And so that's what we built with the PCHR, and I was the standard subject expert, standards SME for standards for the PCHR as we did the build out. And what I was watching was a process that was failing. There was a very clear vision on the part of the politicians and the clinical leads and the clinical community for what they thought they were going to get out of the PCHR. And there was a very clear vision from the vendors about what they could do, and they were not meeting. They were not, it was not going to deliver. And fundamentally, what we built was driven by using CDA. It wasn't driven by requirements or desires. And in that sense, it failed. Now, PCHR didn't fail in lots of important ways, but it failed, from my point of view, in that it didn't deliver what was desired, and that was driven by the standards. And so midway through that process, HL7 recognised that HL7 had problems that were linked to, or that were, and there were problems the PCHR was having was reflected by that. HL7 version 3 wasn't going well when implemented. CDA was okay, but it wasn't what we needed. And that was really the heart of the problem with the PCHR, from my point of view. Version 2 was too limited. It was at the end of its life, and you couldn't really do anything significant new with it. And so HL7 created a Fresh Look task force. And the Fresh Look task force did what Fresh Look task forces generally do for organisations, and they looked at the strategy and said, you just didn't do it hard enough. You need to do it harder. And they doubled down on the general strategy of version 3. And from my point of view, that is a classic organisational blunder. And you can search for double down strategy and find, plenty of analysis about that on the web. And you can see like the Liberal Party deep in it right now. And so I did my own Fresh Look, which I did on my blog, which is still posted. In particular, 2 very famous posts within the health community that I did. One called V3 Has Failed, which generated an enormous amount of attention. There is a matching V3 Has Succeeded, but never mind. And The Wreck of HL7, which is poetry, a very good piece of poetry by a friend of mine. And really, I said, we are not on a sensible strategy. And then in 2011, right smack bang in the middle of the PCHR implementation, the agency had a contracting problem. It's just not an agency thing, but driven by process and government contracting rules that put me out of work for 6 weeks. I couldn't work for the agency for 6 weeks, right bang smack in the middle of all what they needed from me. So I did an actual fresh look. I said, if somebody actually knows what they're doing with interoperability, because I don't think we do anymore, what noise would that create? And then I went looking for that noise, and that led me to a specification called Basecamp. And I just took the Basecamp spec, cloned it, and then adapted it to a health problem, one that I knew really well, and published that as resources for health. And it's still published on the FHIR website as the very first official release as FHIR. So, and the link is there, and this, I'll share this presentation with anyone who asks, and I'll get to give it to the agency. So you can go and see the very, very first draft of what became FHIR. And it was really just what I proposed. And I thought that wouldn't go anywhere, and so much, well, what did I know about life? And it wasn't that this was without risk. And this cartoon from XKCD towered over my life for many years. There's 14 competing standards. That's ridiculous. We need a better one. And now there's 15. And look, that's a real risk. And standards, well, that's the problem. So, yeah, we worried about this a lot. But we set out to define a new standard that builds on the knowledge that HL7 had gained, while not building on any of the standards we had built, which was a challenge, a real challenge. We set out to use web technology, and both in standards and community building. We wanted an open license. We wanted to be very pragmatic and not let theory of design overrule the mess of real life. One of our strong philosophies, which is still very much the case, was test early, test often. That's what we're doing with connectathons, iterate quickly. We wanted to have a very clear model for extensibility. And all this is driven out of, that NETA document that I referred to at the start. Used terminology really well, and we've totally transformed the game there. Open source tooling, open source validation, support all modes of interoperability, and collaborate as widely as we could. Those were our goals, and we've pretty much held to them. We failed in a couple of spaces. Like, really, I wanted something that was much more ontological sound, but that just, for a variety of reasons, that was a step too far. But, by and large, we have fortunately been, blessed with a really enthusiastic community, and we have mostly delivered on our goals. So this is the usual slide that I present. What is FHIR? It's 2 things, a community and a standard. And for me, the community is more important. We make it easier to exchange healthcare information, whatever that means. And that's a boundary problem. What is not healthcare information? We have managed to say no repeatedly to taking on banking. It's hard. We have open participation and is led by HL7. And what we do is we argue about how to solve problems, and then we write down our tenuous agreements, and then we argue about them all over again. And then we update the written documentation, and we just sit in a cycle iterating on that. And you end up with an open standard that describes how to exchange healthcare information. It's public domain. It's a web API where possible. And where possible, we do continuity with existing healthcare standards. And it's turned into really a factory for generating a plethora of related standards with FHIR as the base. And so really nobody implements FHIR outright. They implement FHIR as part of implementing other specifications. Now, one really key part to what FHIR was, which was absolutely radical at the time, and now is just like, well, duh. And that was one of the things that we've changed, is that it's freely available. So anybody can get it from hl7.org/FHIR. It's Creative Commons public domain. So you can do anything you like with the content. We did not reserve any rights. We're much more open than even the open source software licenses. We waived our rights, but we do protect a trademark, which is not the same as protecting the content. You can do whatever you want with the content, and you can use the words FHIR and so forth to refer to what HL7's doing, but we do protect our trademark on that. Now, one big part of what we're doing is it's a social process, and a lot of it is social engineering. And you can't really understand how this works without understanding Tuckman's stages of group development, where a group forms and it has these stormy sessions figuring out what it is and what it's going to be and how it's going to work and what it's going to produce or do. And then you get into a phase where you're honing what you do, you're figuring out how things are going to be done, and then you end up in a phase where everybody's like, no, we've agreed how it's going to be, so you've got to stick to the agreements. Forming, storming, norming, conforming. There's variations of this, and then there's like some groups close out, but this is a social dynamic that applies to people, and you can see it in political parties, churches, sports clubs. Science, and if you're interested in that, everybody should read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it applies to standards development. You get an opportunity early in the standard to direct it, and then it starts to take on a shape that becomes very hard to change. The question for me always with FHIR was, how do you prepare for the future while dealing with these stages of group development? And we have different parts of the standard at very different phases in this process. And we have different people who participate with comfort in different parts of the process. There's people who just love the forming and storming part of it. That is sad. They just love that. And there's other people involved in the standards who find that very off-putting, and you're like, come back to me when you figure that out, and who really want to be involved in the conforming phase. That's why they're doing standards. And so part of it is, managing the people in that process. And I do want to tell you that HL7 was really important in this process, because you need the right community, and the community needs to have the right credentials and the right gravitas. If you're doing it alone, it's not a standard, and it's not going to become a standard. And it's, how do you invent? You have to invent your own maturity process, and then governments and vendors and so forth need to approve of that. This is a big deal. Like from my perspective, the size of the FHIR ecosystem will be in the space of $1 trillion. Don't we getting any of that? But that's the amount of money that will be spent on projects that would need to be respent if you did something. We went back and did it with something other than FHIR. And that's across the world over the life of the project. It's a big deal. It's a big ecosystem you're standardizing. You need the right culture, processes, supervision. From my point of view, HL7 has ANSI looking over its shoulder. And so you need a serious organization that can carry that weight. But at the same time, the organization has to be able to accept transformative change. And that really was a challenge in HL7, but HL7 was willing to go on that journey. We we rebuilt HL7's processes as we developed FHIR. The way HL7 operates now is radically different to the way that it did. And it's a testament to HL7 that it was willing to go on that journey. No, it wasn't easy, and because of volunteer community, so there's people who still think we did, everything wrong. But the organization as a whole was willing to go on that journey while being a serious organization. And it's a big deal. So our goals really are threefold. We want to transform healthcare IT standards. And really, this is done. It's not complete, but it's an inevitable, irreversible process now. Every other standard and everything that HL7 does is being re-engineered and reconfigured to be based around the same basic philosophy of FHIR because it works. And so the healthcare IT standards space, way more pragmatic, way more open, way more tooling focused, way more iterative, way more engaging. Those are things that are sealed now. Then we wanted to transform healthcare IT. Oh, gee, no, IT. I got G's on the brain. Transforming healthcare IT. We wanted to transform products so they were genuinely more interoperable from go, that it wasn't something you bolted on later and it didn't really work properly. This is by no means done. It's by no means sealed, but it is starting to have a really noticeable effect. The goal, the bar for products in terms of interoperability is lifting, and it will continue to lift. We still have plenty of work to be doing as a community, but it's happening. And then we want to transform healthcare itself. It's not enough to just improve the existing processes. For me, the goal of a real healthcare IT standard, a digital standard, is to enable transformation of healthcare by the provision of services that can't be provided now, but ones that make a difference. And I'll come back to that. And that's just beginning. There are projects that have achieved and delivered that by building and leveraging the FHIR standard and community and platform to transform healthcare outcomes for both staff and patients. But in spite of all of the work that we've done, FHIR is not and never will be a silver bullet. It's a nice technology. I love it. It's my baby, right? It's beautiful. But it only captures what everybody's going to agree to. The platform on which we can build additional agreements. But when we get together, I would love for us to have one healthcare specification for the entire world, because everybody agrees. Sorry. Everybody agrees on what we have to do. But in fact, that is not where we are. Countries, domains, we do not agree, and we cannot get to agreement. The more agreement, the earlier we can get agreement, the better we are across the board. But we are driven in terms of what we can achieve by how much we can get people to agree. And as the group of people getting involved gets smaller and shares more in common, they can agree about more. So if we get a group of Australians in the room, we can agree on more than if we get a group of people from everywhere in the world in the room. If we get a group of people from one vendor, they can agree on much more. And so we still have to have a framework for building and capturing those agreements and doing it cumulatively. And that has a price, and we call it extensions, profiles, implementation guides. Love them and hate them, but it's inevitable if we're going to build a working specification in the absence of universal agreement, that we will end up with something like that. So we're now deep into the process of building community. In order to do that, we need a strategy and architecture, both a national overarching strategy and architecture, so that vendors and institutions can invest. And we do now have one in Australia, and I'm thrilled about that. It took a long time to get to having the drive for that. We need good education, and we desperately need to build that in Australia. This presentation is part of the agency's process of building education. And I'm really pleased and thank you, agency, for your work in doing this, but we need more. We always need more of everything. We need more learning and testing opportunities. Spark is running connectathons. I don't think they could happen more often, but we need them to happen more often. So I don't know how we bridge that gap, but That is a really key process. And then we need the ability to have secretariats and editors and communities that convert local issues to local agreements to specifications and learn from our testing opportunities to produce, official Australian specifications. And so we're deep in that process now in Australia, and I'm thrilled to see that playing out. And hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll be worth it. I mean, I totally believe it will. But it's never too late to clutch defeat from the jaws of victory, so we can't take it easy on that. But really, for me, and from the beginning, this was driven by a need for improving patient outcomes. I see this in my family. I see this in everybody's family that I talk to, and this is all around the world. It's the same everywhere. Patient outcomes are still driven by the fog of healthcare, like the fog of war. We have missing data. Partly that's due to privacy and security, and we've got to figure those issues out and manage them. We have problems interpreting the data we have. We don't even have the data that we need in the first place. We have disagreements about what we're doing. We live in a world where data boundaries, record boundaries match our governance boundaries, which are tied to physical boundaries. My goal, I often say this in presentations, my real goal here is to smash the brick walls. And all of these things create unnecessary costs, morbidity and mortality. And there's two ways to look at this, really. One is from a treasury perspective. Every dollar spent on healthcare is a waste of the dollar. It's a dollar spent not building your GDP. You don't want to spend money on healthcare, but you must, because if you don't have a healthy population, you can't grow your GDP. You want to spend less money on healthcare without sacrificing healthcare costs. You stop people from getting sick. You treat them in an outpatient circumstance, you get them out of institutions quicker, and you don't screw up their care when they're in institutions or in care. Nobody knows any other way of getting more health for less money than those things, and those things all need good data. They're all intimately linked to the things on this page. Nobody disagrees with any of what I've just said, as far as I can find. And so investing in digital health, investing in the standards that drive digital health, totally makes sense for a country at a GDP level. And it totally makes sense for each of us who are patients at a morbidity and mortality level. We do not want to be victims of those problems. And so that drives me. And that's why I did FHIR. But I had to try. I had no idea when we started FHIR whether it would be worth it. There were so many headwinds, so many challenges. So much of the initial few years came out of my mortgage. But I had to try because I believed in the community, in digital health, and better healthcare outcomes for my family. And that's why. And compared to expectations, I mean, I am not FHIR. I get a lot of credit for FHIR, but FHIR is a huge community, thousands and thousands of people, and maybe 200 or 300 people full time who work on FHIR and who contribute to FHIR. And yet I am the face, I guess, of the community. And so I want to credit, before I go on, just credit all the unrecognized, unsung people, no doubt many of you on this webinar, who have contributed in the same way, the same kind of reasons that I have to drive FHIR, and I get the glory and you guys don't, and that's just not right. But compared to what I expected when I set on this, it is way more demanding and way more consuming. Fills my life. We're a bit of a crunch at the moment. I don't think I've done anything but FHIR for weeks. It's much more personal than I anticipated. I did not think that I would become the father of FHIR. I did not plan on that, and I did not think it would be so intimately linked to me. But it is so much more rewarding than I expected. We, collectively, the FHIR community, have made a difference. We collectively have built a platform that has made people's lives better, that made people's lives longer, that saved our loved ones. More, we want more. But it has, and that's incredibly rewarding. And so I want to finish up by saying that FHIR, we set out to disrupt healthcare, and it's happening. But really, the goal is to build open community. And so I invite all of you to join us in building open community with or around or on top of FHIR, to make healthcare better and to deliver to us all a better GDP and better healthcare outcomes. Thanks very much. And I'm happy to take questions and comments if there are any.
Thanks, Grahame. No, that was amazing, and always love to hear from you and hear of the passion that you have for FHIR. It's certainly it gets us excited at the agency as well. Does anyone have any questions? I think one has just come through in the Q&A. To respond to you, Ian, yes, we will be publishing the webinar on our agency FHIRside page. If I could just ask you, Rachel, just to drop that link in the chat again. If there's no questions, I've got one for you, Grahame.
Sure.
On your slide where you talk about building community, obviously a lot of things need to happen in parallel. Is there anything that stands out to you as being the most crucial next step for us as a community?
Very focus on the Australian perspective. You know, you as the agency are doing what you can to build specifications and to build community. And I appreciate that. And the government's working really hard to lay down an overarching strategy and to drive adoption. Vendors are, you know, trying to navigate through their competing priorities to attend to that. But I still feel like and we're holding regular connectathons. And so all of the things that I used to say 4 or 5 years ago, I wish we would do any of them. They're all happening. But I think that probably the biggest shortcoming we have is our ability to create an undergraduate pipeline through multiple universities. It's hard for them to find a way to get people to choose to do this. And that doesn't make any sense to me. This is a dream job. It's challenging. It's rewarding. It's max on social justice. It pays well. And you're never going to be out of work. How is it so hard to get people to do it? I think we should stop calling it health informatics and call it something proper, like the bones of AI for healthcare or something, so that everybody wants to do it. But health informatics, what an awful name.
Completely agree with you there, Grahame. We've got a question from Peter. What is your call to action for each of us on the webinar today to advance FHIR with the view of transforming healthcare? Acknowledging we've got a diverse group here. What do you say?
You know, my usual call for action is that if we like having a civil society, and I sure hope you all like having a civil society, it's built from civil participation. And so I encourage everybody on this call to participate in building open community, open treasure somewhere in the healthcare ecosystem, because, you know, all of us have jobs and we have to earn money, but the real benefit comes from sharing that and building shared infrastructure that makes all of our lives better. And so my call to action is for everybody to spend at least a few hours a week participating in building open community around healthcare IT.
Excellent. Thanks, Grahame. And there's some notable initiatives in the sector. You've got HL7 with their connectathons. You've got the Sparked FHIR Accelerator. So there's plenty of opportunity to get involved. We've got another minute or so. Were there any final questions or reflections before we wrap up? If not, I'm quite happy to leave it there. Grahame, thanks again for your time.
Pleasure.
What I'll do, just a final call to action, I guess. We've got our FHIRside chats, which are running on the second Tuesday of every month. The next one is scheduled for the 14th of April. Then we've got our next FHIRside webinar scheduled in a month's time for the 4th Tuesday of the month. So please, if you do have any interest and would like to remain part of the conversation, come along and join our FHIRside community. And that's it from us today. Thanks again. As mentioned, this session recording will be available on our FHIRside webpage.
Thank you.